of the red carpet, Slay the Dragon. In this series, we've been playing e4 and we've been looking at ways to crush the Sicilian defense. We've been using the Smith Morra Gambit and we've been looking at the accepted lines inside of this gambit. So we take back with knight to c3 and we have this position. In the last episode, we looked at d6 and we responded with bishop c4. We did this to set the trap that if black wanted to develop his knight, we can just push our pawn and black can't take this pawn because then we would take black's queen. So instead of developing this knight, black can play g6 and develop this Sicilian dragon structure. Apparently when the bishop fianchettos to g7, this kind of looks like the head of a dragon, and then d6 would be like the tail of the dragon. So when we see this kind of setup, we're going to respond with queen to b3, and we're going to isolate this pawn on f7 so that if black tries to play bishop g7 and complete his dragon setup, we can play bishop takes f7 and get our pawn back and take away castling rights from black. So black has to protect this f7 pawn, and he can do it in two major ways. He can either play e6 or he can play knight to h6. If black plays knight to h6, we can actually just take this knight, and when black takes back, there'll be nothing to defend that pawn. But if black defends by playing pawn to e6, we see that that weakens the d6 pawn. So we can play bishop f4 and attack that weakness. We're now getting ready to play rook to d1 and potentially knight to b5 as well. So that was a little bit of an introduction to how we'll be using the Smith Morra Gambit against the Sicilian Dragon, and now we can go into some concrete lines. So we always play e4, our opponent plays the Sicilian, and we'll play the Smith Morra Gambit. All these variations are going to be off of the accepted lines, so our opponent accepts our gambit and we'll end in a position exactly like this. I would say the overwhelming most common move in this position is knight to c6. Black wants to develop a piece and he knows that developing this knight can be a little dangerous. So our opponent plays knight to c6 and that protects the e5 square. A lot of the moves that black will make in this defense center around protecting the e5 square so that his knight can come out. Whenever we see black develop his knight like this, we're just going to match him and develop our knight as well. Now we're going to look at two ways that black can develop here. One is by starting with the tail of the dragon, d6, and the other is starting with the head of the dragon, g6. Let's look at the tail first. If black plays pawn to d6, we're going to play the move we saw in the last video, bishop to c4. Now remember, this knight still can't come out because we can hit it with e5. We looked at variations in this position in the last video. So black now knows that taking this knight out could potentially be dangerous. So he plays g6 and he's getting ready to fianchetto this bishop. Notice that when black fianchettos his bishop to g7, it'll protect the e5 square, which can further help black's knight develop safely. Whenever we see a move like g6, we're just going to continue on our plan and play queen to b3 and form this battering ram on this f7 pawn. Now also realize here there's no chance for black to attack our pieces because our attack will be coming with check. So black will kind of be on the back foot after a move like this. So black has to defend his f7 pawn. Now there's one main way to do this, and it's by playing e6. I would say if the knight goes to h6, you can just take it with your bishop, so e6. The only problem with e6 is that as soon as the pawn leaves the e7 square, it's not here to defend the d pawn anymore. So the pawn comes up to e6, this f7 pawn is now safe, but the d6 pawn is now a little bit in danger. So how can we directly attack this weakness on d6? We can play bishop to f4. Now if black tries to finish his setup with bishop to g7, we can play knight to b5, and now we have two attackers on this d6 pawn. The only defender is the queen right now. The only solution that black has to defend this pawn is actually just moving his bishop back to the f8 square. And now black is kind of on the back foot here, and white has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces on the board, and he's getting ready to castle on the next move, whereas all of black's pieces are on the back rank except for his one lone knight, and his structure is pretty weak. So let's go back to the main position. We see that our opponent plays knight to c6. We also bring our knight out, and he begins with developing the dragon's tail. We see this move and we play bishop to c4, Every time we see this move, we play queen to b3 and we pile up on this f7 pawn, and the only real way to defend it is by playing e6, leaving d6 a little vulnerable. We attack that weakness with bishop to f4, and we end up in a position like this. Let's think about now if black wanted to attack us with his knight on a5. If he does this now, we actually can't take with check because these pawns are connected here, but we can play check on b5. Black probably doesn't want to move his king and probably doesn't want to move his attacking knight back, so most likely he's going to defend with his own bishop. I would say the move here is to just move the queen calmly out of the way of the attacking knight, and if black wants to trade bishops, that will just send our knight into b5 anyway, getting ready to take over this d6 square. The most common move from here is rook to c8, attacking our queen, but this just allows us to set up discoveries with queen to a4. Now, wherever we move this knight, it's going to be check on the next move, and black is still 1, 2, 3 moves away from castling, whereas white can castle pretty much any time he wants. So we looked at how black can attack our queen and bishop by playing knight to a5, and we looked at this in-between move with the bishop. We also saw how our queen can sneak back to c2 if it ever needs to run away. And now the goal of this battering ram has kind of been complete. If we can't take on f7, what we want to do is damage black's structure and then retreat our pieces safely. So let's say instead of playing knight to a5 here, black plays a6. What he's trying to do with this move is discourage us from playing knight to b5, because then he can just take it. If we just tried to play a lazy move like rook d1 here, now this knight to a5 move truly works. We can no longer check on b5 with our bishop, and if we tried to check with the queen, we would just run into black's bishops. So now if we see a move like a6, we're actually just going to drop our bishop back to e2. We don't need this battering ram anymore because black already played e6, weakening his structure but protecting his f7 pawn. So the job of this battering ram has essentially already been completed, and we know that either knight a5 or b5 is coming on the next move, and it's gonna destroy this battering ram anyway. So we bring our bishop back to safety, and now the overall goal is to play rook to d1, further putting pressure on this d6 pawn and get castled. Black is probably going to struggle to get castled because he has to maintain 2 defenders on this pawn at all times. Black can't push this pawn because this will completely open up the center where his king is, and he also can't fianchetto his bishop because that would abandon the d6 square. Let's say black does try to bring his bishop. Now we can play rook to d1 and put 2 attackers on this d6 pawn. Let's say we do this, how can black defend this d6 pawn? He could try kicking away our bishop with e5, but this only further weakens his structure. We can just drop our bishop back and we're ready to bring our bishop into b6 on the next move. Not only this, but playing e5 opens up the d5 square for our knight, and it should make this game even easier to win for white. So if we go back to the beginning, let's look at what happens when black develops the head of the dragon first. Black plays g6, and now we can continue on our plan of playing bishop to c4, attacking this f7 square. Black now plays bishop to g7, developing the head of his Sicilian dragon, but you'll realize that his dragon, even though it has the head here, it doesn't have the tail on d6. What was the job of that tail? It was to protect e5. So because this tail isn't here to protect e5, we're going to play e5 and take up that space. You may notice that black has 2 attackers on this pawn, and we only have 1 defender. So when black goes to take our pawn, we can just take back with the knight, and when black takes with the bishop, we can sacrifice on f7. We've now taken castling rights away from black, and we can now play queen to d5, checking the king and also getting our piece back. The most common move here is just playing e6, and now we can take back this bishop with an attack on the rook on h8. There's really only 2 most common moves here, is either defending with the knight or defending with the queen. If black blocks with the queen, we definitely do not want to trade down. We want to use our activity to win the game, so I think a good square for the queen would probably be c7. We're now pinning this pawn to the king, and our knight is also getting ready to jump into e4, attacking the queen. He can also go to b5 if he wants, and both of these squares can plant him on d6. This will be a great outpost for our knight. We can think about castling on the next move and then sending our bishop somewhere safe where it can eventually attack black's queen and king. Now let's look at when black defends with the knight. Because he didn't block with the queen, we don't actually have to worry about moving the queen right now. So this is a perfect time to play knight to b5. We want to cement our knight into the d6 square and essentially stop both of black's center pawns from advancing down the board. So the main idea is to get this knight into d6, castle, and then same as last time, develop this bishop somewhere where it can be safe and attack black's king. So now let's go back to this moment where we initially check black on d5. Higher level players do not play this e6 move because it damages their structure too much. Instead, they just accept that they're going to lose their bishop and move over to g7. When we take black's bishop, they play knight to f6. Eventually, black is going to try to play rook to f8 and try to castle manually and just win this game a pawn up. If we go back to when this pawn was offered to black, there's one main way that black can refuse this gambit, and it's instead of playing f6, which is right now unavailable for the knight, he can play h6. What this move does is it allows black to get castled on the next move, and then he can move his knight to this f5 square and hopefully get all of his pieces safely oriented. If we ever see this, we can now just go and defend our pawn with our bishop by playing bishop to f4. Black can castle, and we can castle as well. And you can see that black is now a pawn up, but we have much more activity than black does. We can advance our position by playing queen d2 in the future and look to attack this misplaced knight. So that's pretty much it for slaying the dragon. Let's just see if we can wrap everything up. So black wants to play in a dragon style structure with d6 and g6 pawns. The d6 pawn defends this e5 square, and the g6 pawn allows a square for the bishop to come to. Many times you'll see the black player bring his c6 knight out and we reciprocate, and as he goes to build this structure, we put our bishop on c4. He continues building his Dragon Sicilian, and now we corner this f7 pawn. There's no time to build the dragon because we'll take it, so we force this pawn out. We can now continue isolating this d pawn, and we've looked at how black can try to counter this by playing knight to a5. In other lines, black forgoes this dragon's tail to build the dragon's head first. We have the same plan here, but now instead of playing queen to b3, we realize that this dragon has no tail, so we can take over e5. We looked at what happens after this trade of knights. We're going to sack on f7 and get our bishop back. The best way to respond to this move is just moving the king over and letting the knight develop like this. We just responded to this move by castling, and now we're just going to play normal chess from here. We can get our rooks to the center and look to advance our knight down the board. So that's all for the Red Carpet 2 Slay the Dragon. This has been crushing the Sicilian defense with the Smith Morra Gambit. In the next video, the Red Carpet 3, we're going to look at the Khan formation. This is when black brings out his knight like he usually does, but instead of playing d6 and looking for a dragon style setup, he's going to play e6. This opens the door for his dark square bishop, and it also prevents our bishop from looking directly at his f7 pawn. In the future, he's going to start to play a6, and we'll look at how we can deal with moves like that. Thank you guys so much for watching, and stay tuned for the next video.